Chapter 8. Ludonus and Saint Kentigern. After recording the vice or folly of so many Roman princes, it is pleasing to repose for a moment on a character conspicuous by the qualities of humanity, justice, temperance, and fortitude. To contemplate a sovereign affable in his palace, pious in the church, impartial on the seat of judgment, and victorious, at least by his generals. The History of the Decline of the Roman Empire, Edward Gibbon. When the three returned to the house in Davie, Florida, after Damianos had checked that the coast was clear, they settled in the den for the rest of the night. They almost had to be careful when roaming through the house. The new owner and his family had been frightened by unwarranted apparitions in the past couple of years, and since then Damianos had made a point of being careful when bringing Dan back to Davie. That night Dan was of two minds. He wanted to learn a lot more about his ancestors, but what secrets would he discover? On one hand, he wanted to know all there was to know about them, yet he wasn't sure he wanted to intrude on their past. They seemed to have been disseminated throughout Europe and Britain from the time of the fall of the Ghassanid Empire. The heirs had obviously taken refuge in Lebanon and had held to the other parts of the world. It is quite incredible, Dan remarked, taking a seat across from Damianos and Gustavo in the den. The branches of the Ghassan family seem to have been dispersed far and wide, haven't they?
Yes, Dan, the forefathers that are mentioned on your sovereign and the royal appointment are only the prominent figures of your past lives. As Merlin told you, as King Uther Pendragon, you had a future that would be recorded through times as legendary.
But is all that true? I mean, did my forefathers truly fought wars to earn the love of a woman? Damianos and Gustavo exchanged an amused glance.
Would you not fight to the death for the love of your wife, Dan?
Well, of course, but from giving one's life for one's love to engaging two nations into a war for the love of one woman, there is a huge difference, isn't there?
These men were conquerors, Dan. They fought until death would bring them back to their makers. They had convictions of which we understand little in modern times.
I suppose it would be like a vocation or a calling, wouldn't it? Gustavo suggested.
Damianos nodded. When going into the priesthood, such as our friend the Red Cardinal did centuries ago, it was an irrevocable decision. Armand Duplessis was not due to enter the clergy. His brother was, yet Armand could not be stopped in attaining his desired station in life.
The three of them fell silent for a moment until Dan asked, Merlin mentioned the King Ledonus of Lothium. Who is he? Is he related to the Ghassanids?
Indirectly, but yes, Damianos answered. He was the husband of King Arthur's sister, Anna, as the daughter of other Dan Anna carried the bloodline of Constantine and of other ancestors such as the Parmireni, Empress Aurelia Zenobia.
Is there another reason for Uther's brother being named Aurelius? Gustavo queried.
Ha ha ha, Damianos laughed. Yes, Gustavo, you seem to be very observant of the names that carried through the ages, are you not?
Well, I guess that's one way of keeping all these names and ancestors' lineages in some sort of order.
Yes, it is, Damianos agreed, returning his attention to Dan. And now why don't you read some of your book's story about Ledonus or Lothium?
Dan, looking down, his book was in his lap. He seemed hesitant to open it.
What's wrong? Damianos asked. Why don't you want to know a little more about this man?
I'm not sure I do, Damianos. All I heard for the past few days are stories of men and women who died at the hands of tyrants or during amazing wars. Is there someone a little more sedate amongst those that I would need to meet or to know?
At the moment, no, Dan. Ledonus, as you will read, was not a sedate man. He too filled the history books and legends with his exploits. However, he was not alone in his travels. King Arthur, the Man of Wales, directed most of his brother-in-law's actions. He was a persona and a force to be reckoned with. Nevertheless, Anna, Ludonus' wife, gave birth to 5 sons and a daughter, Gawain, Agravain, Gatharis, Gareth, and Mordred, and Tuina, Tenny. Except for Mordred and Tenny, all of them reigned over principalities in northern England, Wales, and Europe, but as you will read, we are reaching a crossroad at the issue of this ancestry line.
What do you mean? What sort of crossroad are we talking about? Why don't you find out, Dan? Gustavo said, reclining to the back of the chair. Okay, here it goes, Dan replied, opening the book. The hand of Anna, sister of Arthur, is given to a king of Lothian, Orkney and Norway, whence Arthur succeeds his father, Uther Pendragon on the throne, he and his brother-in-law are not in agreement regarding the government of Britain and Western Europe. Lot, as your relative is called, opposes Arthur. It does not take long for Lot to enlist the loyalties and armies of other kings of Britannia to raise arms against Arthur. Bedegraine is the seat of the battle where Arthur defeats his brother-in-law in the bloodiest battle of the time. There is no mercy amongst the men who fought against Lot. However, when Lot realizes that his future resides in the coalition of his armies with those of Arthur, the two men join forces to fend off the Saxons of Brittany. At the issue of the Battle of Bedegraine, Arthur hears that a child will be born on May Day that will annihilate him. Ruthless and fearless as Arthur was, he assembles all of the noble babies born around that time, including Anna's son Mordred. He has no mercy, and orders that all of the children be put aboard a ship and sent adrift in high seas. Dan looked up from his reading. That's absolute despotic. How could anyone do that?
Dan, you need to put your mind at rest. As revolting as King Arthur's actions were, they did not go unpunished.
And I hope redemption was not his to reach, Dan objected, because the man did not deserve any.
Perhaps not, Dan, but remember, no man could sit in judgment of another, and God's word does not vary whether we talk about a man the likes of Arthur or the likes of you.
I would never send an infant aboard a vessel to run adrift at sea, Dan flared. That could not be forgiven, I am sure.
And you are possibly right, for in this instance Lot was so disgusted and insoluble. Remember, Mordred was his youngest son, and he made an alliance with Arthur's enemy, Rience, and returned to warfare against his brother-in-law. Arthur might have escaped death at the hand of a child on May Day, but he did not escape being killed during battle at Camlan at 537 AD.
What happened to Anna and the other children then? Gustavo asked.
Perhaps Dan could read the rest of the story for us,
Domino said, fixing his gaze on Dan. The latter nodded and resumed reading. Ludonus was gratified later in life with the birth of a grandson, Mungo. The gratification, however, did not come with ease. When Ludonus discovers that his daughter, Tenny, has been flirting with Owen Mad Urin and becomes pregnant, he throws his daughter off a cliff, but God was not to let this event go unimpeded. Due to divine intervention, the young maiden survives the fall. Once she has recovered from her injuries, she is put into a coracle, which takes her down the River Forth and to Fife, where she gives birth to Mungo. He will be canonized upon his death at St. Kentigern. Did any of these men have regards for life or for God's creation? Dan was incensed.
They did, Dan, but their sense of honour was not tamed yet, and please remember we are in the midst of medieval times, a very troubled era. Even Shakespeare, who wrote many of the stories that occurred between the 5th and 17th centuries, describes the life of King Lear, for example, as a tragedy.
Dan closed his book, stood up, and began pacing the length of the room. I can't visualize such atrocities, Damianos. We criticize the young hooligans that vandalize their neighborhoods. We admonish the killer for his action. We demand peace and justice from the tyrants of our time, but we do not seem to learn from our history or ancestry. He stopped and grabbed the back of the sofa, facing his two companions, before he went on. Why do I have to relive such lives as those of men who have inflicted so much pain onto others? I am not like them. Although books upon books will describe the lives of these men, I do not feel I am their son. On the contrary, I would feel better if my lineage would show that I am their executioner.
The reason you are to relive these lives, Dan, is simply to show that your being from royal or noble blood does not mean you are to be the man each of these royal heads once were. Moreover, you have learned from their mistakes. You have cherished your family, you have cared for your descendants, and you have inherited the secret of those good men that reigned over land and sea.
And I guess we can't forget St. Kentigern, Gustavo suggested. God wanted him to be born and to live an exemplary life after his grandfather's disastrous conduct and King Arthur's despotic behaviour. Do we know anything more about St. Kentigern? Dan asked, regaining his seat on the sofa.
We do, in fact. I'd love to tell you about this incredible man.
Why? Do you have an affinity with him? Dan questioned.
Not an affinity, no, yet I find his devotion to the Lord was consummate. He was tireless in his preaching, as you will soon hear, and I think this man, more than his ancestors, deserves our respect and admiration.
Dan smiled, perhaps for the first time since their return from Italy after their meeting with the young Armand Duplessis. Go ahead, then, he told Damianos.
All right,
the old shepherd replied, crossing his arms over his chest.
First, there are a couple of details that your book didn't mention, Dan. For example, Ledonus ruled over the Hattington region, which is now known as Scotland, and the kingdom of Gotodin in the north. When Tenny Mungo's mother was born, she was destined to marry a prince of her father's choice. However, love has no master, and Tenny fell in love, as your book recounts, with Owen Mad Urine. Tenny is soon with child and obliged to inform her father. He flies into a rage and throws his daughter off the cliff, trap Rain Law. The site of this horrible attempted murder is still visible today, but as you know, Tenny survived the fall and subsequently abandoned in a coracle, a small boat, and sent down the River Forth to Culross in Fife, where she gives birth to her son Mungo.
This is what I find intolerable, Damianos, Dan said. These men sending their children to die, I cannot abide with the concept. It's simply barbaric, I find.
All right, let's accept your comments, Dan, but let me remind you once more that you are the man you are today because of your character, conspicuous by the qualities of humanity, justice, temperance, and fortitude, to contemplate a sovereign affable in his palace, pious in the church, impartial on the seat of judgment. To quote Edward Gibbon, you have inherited the traits and spirits of many brave men who, in turn, had their failings such as you have yours today.
Okay, Dan said, nodding. Why don't you go on with the story?
Good. So Mungo was brought up by the Saint Serf, who, at the time, lived in Scotland. Under Serf's guidance, Mungo began his missionary work in Clyde, which is today called Glasgow.
That's interesting, Gustavo cut in. As you said, all of these people seem to have been dispersed everywhere in Europe, haven't they?
Yes, Gustavo, Damianos answered, and perhaps none more than those English, Scottish, and Italian families.
He paused and returned his gaze to Dan.
But let's continue with Kentigern's story. Mungo established quite a parish in that city, and even extended his ministry to Mollendinner Burn near an ancient volcano. Today the Cathedral of Mollendare stands on the ground where Mungo first preached. He lived modestly and led a secluded life where he dedicated mostly to his preaching until he was forced to leave the area under the menace of persecution by the Strathclyde and anti-Christian movement. King Morcan, who led the movement, sent Mungo to Wales, his place of origin down the road from Cumbria, where he found lodging with another devoted Christian who was to be known later as St. David. At the end of his life, Mungo returned to Glasgow, where he managed to draw a large Christian community around his parish of Glasgow. After meeting with St. Columba in Strathtyr, he continued to lead a reclusive life until his death. Later, Mungo moved to Gwynedd, where he established a cathedral of St. Saph. At the end of his life, Mungo returned to Glasgow.